This story, though seemingly incredible, is based on real events, emotions, and their devastating consequences, serving as a poignant reminder of the depth of human feelings when a heart is broken. Chapter 1: Shadows of the Past. John Miller, a former officer in the United States Marine Corps, was acutely aware that life after service would not be easy. Years spent under strict discipline, daily dangers, and a rigid routine had left an indelible mark on his soul and body. Returning to a quiet San Francisco suburb, he hoped to find long-awaited solace and peace within his family. His wife, Sarah Miller, with whom he had lived for over a decade, had always seemed the epitome of loyalty and unwavering support. Their 6-year-old son, Liam, was the pride and meaning of his entire life, an anchor in the stormy ocean of war memories. However, something had subtly changed over the past few months. John began to notice a coldness in Sarah's words, her inexplicable irritability, and visits with friends, once a rarity, had now become suspiciously frequent and prolonged. Previously, he would never have thought to doubt her, but something in her behavior constantly put him on edge. It wasn't just instinct, it was a barely perceptible shift in her aura, subtle changes in their usual routine that a former Marine, accustomed to reading nonverbal cues, could not ignore. One evening, as torrential rain lashed against the windows of their modest home, John felt an unusual, piercing unease. Sarah was supposed to have returned 2 hours ago, but her phone was silent. Liam was already asleep, peacefully snoring in his crib. John sat in the darkness of the living room, his gaze fixed on his phone screen, as if it could answer his silent, anxious questions. Suddenly, the phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. John's heart skipped a beat. He answered the call, and a gruff, hoarse male voice came through the receiver. "Do you know what your wife does when she says she's working late?" The voice was low, almost threatening, yet with a hint of eerie calm that made it even more sinister. John felt a chilling cold sweep through his body. His fists clenched, knuckles white, and his throat was dry as if he had just swallowed sand. The man continued without waiting for an answer. "She's with another man right now. If you want to see for yourself, come to this address." The voice trembled, betraying a strange mix of pity and gloating that only intensified John's disgust and horror. Before John could ask a single question, the connection was cut. He remained sitting in the dark, clutching the phone, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Endless thoughts whirled in his mind, colliding with each other. Is this a mistake? Is someone trying to prank us? But instantly a chilling question followed. What if it's true? The bitter truth, like a shard of ice, pierced his heart. He couldn't breathe. Leaving Liam in the care of Mrs. Evelyn, the kind elderly neighbor, John dressed. He didn't hesitate for a second. His body moved on autopilot, obeying long-forgotten instincts developed in critical situations. He drove to the address given in the call. The rain continued to pour, creating an almost cinematic, oppressive atmosphere. The drops striking the car's hood were like hammers pounding on his heart, beating out the rhythm of his growing pain and fear. John drove, looking at the road through the blurred glass, and each new kilometer brought him more pain and a terrible, piercing fear. As he pulled up to the specified house, his heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed its sound could be heard even outside. Chapter 2: Unexpected Betrayal, a Split in the Family. The light in the second-story window was on, and the shadows of 2 figures flickered behind the thin curtain like ghosts of his worst nightmares. John stopped the car and stepped out, immediately getting soaked from head to toe in the pouring rain. At that moment, everything seemed unreal, as if he were observing himself from the outside, unable to believe that this was his life, his Sarah, his betrayal. With every passing second, he realized more and more, if this was true, his life would never be the same. John stood in the rain, which no longer felt cold. A storm far more fierce and destructive raged in his soul. Dozens of scenarios whirled in his head. Maybe it's a misunderstanding? Maybe it's not Sarah in the window at all? But an internal voice, quiet and persistent, whispered that everything was exactly as he had been told. He couldn't believe that the woman with whom he had shared so many years could act this way. Climbing the slippery stairs of the entrance, he stopped before the apartment door, behind which he was sure lay the bitter, unbearable truth. A thought flashed through his mind that it would be better to leave, to go home, and try to forget. But pride and despair prevailed, like 2 mighty waves engulfing his mind. John knocked decisively. Silence. A few moments later, footsteps were heard, and the door slowly creaked open. Sarah appeared on the threshold. Her eyes widened with horror and surprise when she saw John, soaked through. In her gaze was a mixture of fear and guilt that she didn't manage to hide before a mask of pretense could descend. John's voice was hoarse and choked. "Sarah." The words treasonously wouldn't come out. Behind her, in the dim light of the room, a man's figure flashed. John instantly recognized him. It was Victor Thorne, his old friend and fellow soldier, with whom he had once shared shelter and food during dangerous combat operations. Rage boiled in John's eyes, and he felt his muscles tense, ready for action. "So, this is where your work meetings take place, Sarah?" John hissed bitterly, stepping forward, but not allowing her to slam the door shut. "John, this isn't what you think." She tried to justify herself, but her voice sounded too uncertain, too false to be plausible. Victor stepped forward, looking into John's eyes with an expression of a certain arrogant calmness that only added fuel to the fire of his raging fury. He spread his hands as if trying to excuse his presence. "John, let's talk." But John was no longer listening. The ground seemed to be slipping from beneath his feet. Anger mixed with pain, creating something uncontrollable, primitive within him. He lunged at Victor with such force that Victor didn't have time to react and crashed against the wall with a thud. Sarah screamed, trying to stop her husband, but her hands hung limply when she saw the wild, uncontrollable fire blazing in John's eyes. "You called me brother?" John snarled through clenched teeth, grabbing Victor by the collar of his shirt. "You ate at my table. You played with my son." Victor tried to break free, but John was stronger. His body remembered years of training and battles. He pinned his rival against the wall, ready to do anything to make him feel the same pain he was feeling now. "Stop it," Sarah exclaimed, sobbing. Her face was pale, her eyes glistening with tears. "We are to blame, but John didn't listen. Don't do it." Her words didn't cut through his mind like a knife. In his consciousness, the years they had spent together whirled. The wedding dance, their son's first laugh, evening walks under the stars. All of it now seemed an illusion, a ghost of the past shattered into fragments. John slowly released Victor, who was breathing heavily, avoiding his gaze. The officer took a step back, clenching his fists to restrain himself from further irreversible actions. "I can't be here right now," John whispered, looking at Victor, who was breathing heavily, and at Sarah, whose tears streamed down her cheeks. Time seemed to stand still, each moment stretching into infinity as tension filled the room to its limit. A storm raged inside John, the pain of betrayal mixed with hatred that filled his entire being. An instinct, owned by years of service, held him back, prompting. He needed to retreat, collect his thoughts, and act coldly. He turned and, without a word, left the apartment. The rain continued to pour, cold drops of water hitting his face, mixing with sweat and barely restrained, invisible tears. He froze in the car, not starting the engine, clutching the steering wheel. It wasn't just the pain of a broken car hood, but shattered hopes for a happy family. On the way home, he didn't remember driving, didn't remember shifting gears. Memories spun in his head. Every word, every smile from Sarah now seemed a lie, a cunning deception. He pulled up to the house where little Liam was still sleeping, completely unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded in his father's life. John opened the door with his key and entered his son's room to make sure he was all right. The boy was sleeping, hugging his favorite teddy bear, quietly snoring. John knelt beside the bed, feeling the weight of what had happened pressing down on him, crushing his soul. He couldn't allow himself to lose composure for his son's sake, for his future. But the thought of revenge was already taking root in his mind, strong and relentless. Chapter 3. The Bitter Truth, John's Revenge. The next morning, John woke up with a surprisingly clear head, though he had barely slept. Lying in bed, he listened to the sounds of the house waking up. Liam woke up and mumbled something, trying to find a toy. John got up and prepared breakfast. He smiled at his son, trying to ensure his face betrayed no pain, no shadow of the destruction he was experiencing. "Dad, where's Mom?" Liam asked, playing with his spoon in the porridge. John froze for a fraction of a second before answering, "She has work today, son. She'll be back later." This lie came easily to him, almost automatically. He realized that he had to meticulously plan his actions, concealing his true intentions. The habit of thinking through every move, born during years of service, helped him maintain composure despite the inner storm tearing him apart. Over the next week, John spent his time observing Sarah. She returned home later than usual. Her phone conversations were brief and dry, devoid of their usual warmth. Sometimes she tried to speak to him, but her words were laced with uncertainty, as if she feared their secret meetings were continuing. Each time he saw her, John's heart clenched with dull anger, but his face remained calm, emotionless, like a mask. With each new encounter, a chilling wall of silence hung in the house, only strengthening John's resolve. He knew that a simple conversation was not enough here. The truth was needed, firm and undeniable. He understood that sooner or later, the plan would have to be put into action and everything needed to be prepared with maximum caution. John began to re-establish old connections with former colleagues who, after leaving military service, had found work in various places. Some of them became private detectives, while others engaged in activities not always within the bounds of the law. One evening, he contacted David Cross, an old friend who had taken up private investigations after his service. David was known for his sharp mind and willingness to help comrades in difficult times, and John knew he could fully rely on him. "David, I need your help," John said briefly over the phone. "John Miller, do you ever call just to chat?" David grumbled, but his voice carried genuine concern. "What happened?" "I'll tell you when we meet," John paused. "It's personal, understood? Tomorrow at 8, at our old spot." David's voice became serious. "Understood. I'll be there." John hung up and for a moment felt the weight on his heart lighten slightly. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but now he had a plan, and he intended to follow it to the end, to its bitter or sweet conclusion. The next morning was overcast and heavy. Low gray clouds hung over the city, reflecting John's mood. He woke before dawn and gathered his thoughts before leaving the house. Liam was still asleep. His serene face was the last reminder of the peaceful life John had tried so hard to preserve. But the time for playing calm was over. John arrived at a familiar coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, where he and David often met after service, sharing memories and future plans. The place was inconspicuous, with old wooden tables and chairs that creaked with the slightest movement. David was already waiting for him at a far table, looking out the window and quietly tapping his fingers on a glass of coffee. When John entered, their eyes met, and David nodded, inviting him to sit. "You look like you haven't slept in nights," David remarked, studying his friend. His gray eyes were attentive and perceptive, instantly grasping John's inner state. John sat opposite him and paused for a moment, considering where to start. "I need to know everything about Victor Thorne, about his life recently." David raised his eyebrows but remained silent, allowing John to continue. "He destroyed my family." John clenched his fists, feeling anger welling up again in his throat. "And I'm not going to let this go." David nodded, asking no unnecessary questions. He understood that this was not just about jealousy or a fleeting affair. It was deeper, much deeper. Years of service had taught him to recognize true pain and incinerating rage. David scratched his chin and said briefly, "I'll see what I can do. Victor has his own security company now, as far as I remember, but who knows what else he's involved in." They exchanged a few more words before John left the coffee shop. Now all that remained was to wait for David to gather the information. John returned home and tried to maintain a semblance of normal life. Sarah came home later than usual. She avoided his gaze and seemed barely able to control her nervousness. With each new encounter, a chilling wall of silence hung in the house, which only strengthened John's resolve. He knew that a simple conversation was not enough here. The truth was needed, firm and undeniable. A few days later, David called. "I found something. Let's meet." The meeting was arranged in an empty parking lot in the city center, where it was deserted and quiet in the evening. John arrived on time, and David handed him a thick folder with printouts and photographs. "Victor got involved in questionable dealings, John." David began, twirling keys in his hand. "His company, Thorne Security, is being used as a front for smuggling, and, according to reports, he has serious financial obligations that could cause his unpredictable behavior." John opened the folder. One photo showed Victor at the entrance of an office building. Another showed him in the company of unknown men looking no less severe than himself. "Are these his partners?" John asked, not looking away from the pictures. "Yes, some of them are former military, others are people from the shadowy side of business," David replied. "Your revenge might be harder than you thought, John." John closed the folder and closed his eyes for a moment. This was exactly what he wanted to hear, confirmation that his enemy was not flawless. But it also meant that any mistake on his part could be fatal, possibly even deadly. "Thanks, David. I'll handle it," John said, feeling his resolve only strengthen. "Be careful, John. Your emotions can work against you," David threw out as a parting remark. But John no longer heard him. He was deep in thought about the next step, which could mark the beginning of the end not only for Victor, but for everything he had built. Chapter 4. Trap. John's retribution. The next few days John spent in meticulous preparation. He knew that his enemy was intelligent and dangerous, and any mistake would cost him everything, possibly even the lives of his loved ones. But he also knew that he had an advantage: his composure and the skills he had acquired during years of service in the Corps. Each day was part of his new, hidden life, masked by the guise of ordinary affairs. Sarah behaved strangely. She became more withdrawn, tried to avoid him, and was lost in her own thoughts. John observed her, trying to read her emotions and understand how far her connection with Victor had gone. With every look, with every conversation, his conviction only grew stronger. A break was inevitable, but it had to be on his terms. David continued to support him, helping to collect data about Victor and his company. He recently reported that Victor was planning a large cargo transshipment deal of suspicious origin, which in itself was an excellent opportunity for a strike. John understood that this was a chance to catch Victor red-handed and simultaneously make him pay for everything he had done. The plan was simple: create a situation in which Victor would be forced to make a mistake. For this, John used old contacts with people who still had influence in the shadow business. They agreed to help him unofficially, maintaining anonymity and avoiding risk to their reputation. The day of the deal turned out to be surprisingly sunny, as if nature itself was mocking the gloomy events to come. John watched the warehouse from an abandoned building opposite. In his hands, he held a small pair of binoculars, examining every detail, every potential entrance and exit. The truck arrived exactly on time, and John noticed Victor coming out to meet his guests. There was something tense in his posture, as if he sensed that something was wrong. John squinted, observing the exchange. Two men with stern faces and rough movements got out of the car and began inspecting the cargo. Victor behaved tensely. His voice sounded sharp as he gave commands. John felt a surge of adrenaline when he realized that the moment was near. At John's signal, shouts and noise were heard. Shots rang out blank cartridges, creating the illusion of an attack. The warehouse filled with chaos. Men scrambled, trying to understand where the threat was coming from. Victor rushed to one of the boxes, trying to check its contents, but was stopped by a masked figure appearing from the shadows. "Hands up, Victor!" John's voice was hoarse, like that of a man who had been through hell, distorted and low. Victor froze, his face pale, eyes wide with horror. "J. John, is that you?" "Yes, it's me." John moved closer, pointing the pistol at his old friend. "Today you will answer for everything." Victor breathed heavily, his hands trembling, but he tried to maintain his composure. "You don't understand what you're getting into, John. This isn't just my game." John smirked, but there was no joy in his eyes, only cold, steely determination. "You destroyed my family, you betrayed me, and this is the end." Victor howled, trying to pull out a weapon, but realized he had no chance to escape. "John!" He took a step forward, trying to start a conversation. But at that moment, there was a sharp clap. David gave the signal from the other end. The police were already close. "Time's up," John curtly stated and retreated, disappearing into the shadows before the first sirens were heard. David and his associates did not manage to hide and were arrested. John watched the events from a distance. His heart was pounding madly. This was the first victory, a small step towards destroying the man who had caused him so much pain. But he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 5, Pandora's Box, Victor's Revenge. The morning after the operation was quiet and unusually calm. John sat in the kitchen, looking out the window, trying to comprehend what had happened. Fragments of memories spun in his head: Victor's frightened face, flashes of light from police sirens, the sound of sirens echoing through the streets. It was a victory, but its taste was bitter, like ashes. He knew that consequences would follow. Sarah returned home early in the morning, and her face betrayed a sleepless night. She carefully entered the kitchen, paused, seeing John sitting with a cup of cold coffee. "John, didn't you sleep again?" He didn't answer immediately, looking at her with cold composure. Her face looked tired, but beneath it lay something more, a shadow of guilt and fear that she tried in vain to hide. "Did you hear what happened to Victor?" he finally asked, not looking away. Sarah flinched, her eyes momentarily filled with panic. She shook her head, but her attempt to hide her emotions was futile. John placed the cup on the table. He moved closer and spoke, lowering his voice. "He was arrested yesterday, right at the warehouse. Do you really know nothing?" Her eyes darted from side to side as she tried to find suitable words. John saw her lips tremble, and this spurred him to action. "Enough lies, Sarah. It's over. I know what he meant to you." Sarah burst into tears. She covered her face with her hands, trying to suppress her sobs, but they broke free like a long-held avalanche. This was not what John wanted. He had expected a sense of satisfaction to come when the truth was revealed, but instead he felt only emptiness and deep pity for this broken woman. It was a mistake, she whispered, not looking up. I got confused myself. I didn't want it to end this way. John turned away, not wanting to see her tears. He knew that the conversation wouldn't change anything. The pain of betrayal was too deep, and forgiveness seemed impossible. Meanwhile, at the police station, Victor sat in the interrogation room. His hands were cuffed, his face covered in scratches and bruises from a failed attempt to resist arrest. The officer at the table, an elderly man with perceptive eyes, carefully studied him. We received an anonymous call about your activities, he began, flipping through documents. What can you say about that? Victor's thoughts were focused on something else. Yesterday's ambush left no doubt as to who was behind it, John Miller. This man proved to be more cunning than he had anticipated. Victor clenched his teeth, imagining the face of his former friend, who had now turned into a sworn enemy. After several hours of silence and formal questions, Victor finally spoke, his voice low and threatening. He opened Pandora's box. Let him know. Revenge will not be long in coming, and John will be the first to find out. A few days later, Victor found a way to deliver a message. One of his contacts at the police station, a man with a questionable past, delivered a note to David, knowing that he would sooner or later inform John. The words on the slip of paper were brief but threatening. You opened Pandora's box. Now you will learn what it means to lose everything. David handed the note to John at their next meeting in his apartment. The friend's face showed noticeable concern, which was rare for him. He promises a counterattack, David said, looking into John's eyes. This is a warning that cannot be ignored. John read these few lines over and over, feeling tension fill his muscles. Victor would not give up. This was only the first step in their new game. A game where not only their old friendship, but also their future and lives were at stake. Chapter 6. The gathering storm, preparing for the fight. John couldn't shake off the feeling of impending doom. The note delivered by David was like a dark cloud hanging over his home. He knew that Victor wouldn't stop at threats, and he understood that he had little time to prepare for the blow that was about to fall upon him. He sat in his study surrounded by documents and notes. On the table lay that very folder with information about Victor, his partners, and deals, which had become the starting point for all subsequent events. John tried to think several steps ahead, but each time he came to the conclusion that it was impossible to guard against everything. But nevertheless, he had to remain focused and vigilant. Suddenly, laughter echoed from the hallway, and John heard the front door slam. Liam returned from a walk with the neighborhood children and, seeing his father, rushed to him with a smile. The momentary joy in his son's eyes made John forget his troubles for a moment. But deep down, anxiety continued to gnaw at him. How was your walk? He smiled reservedly. Cool, Dad. We found a cool rock by the river. At that moment, Sarah entered the house. Her gaze met John's, and a spark of tension flew between them. She knew he was aware of her betrayal, and he knew she was afraid of a confrontation. Nevertheless, both remained silent, immersed in their own heavy thoughts. At night, when the house fell silent, John sat in the dark, listening to the city's night sounds. Over the past few days, he had called former comrades with whom he had served side by side in hot spots. Some of them had left the army and pursued their own affairs, but the old brotherhood still lived in their hearts. Several people agreed to help, offering their support in unforeseen circumstances. David called late in the evening. I have bad news, John. His voice was grim. The court decided to release Victor on bail. He will be out tomorrow. John felt a chill run down his spine. This was predictable, but it happened too quickly nonetheless. So tomorrow the next chapter begins, he quietly replied, clenching his fist. The next morning, the city was covered in a thick fog, concealing the streets, as if nature itself was trying to warn of what was coming. John watched from the window as cars drove through the streets, and thought about what steps Victor would take. He had no doubt that Victor would try to regain control and assert his superiority. A little later, David came to him with important news. I found out Victor is going to meet one of his old business partners, David said, sitting at the table and nodding at the printed pages. He will be looking for a way to restore his position and strike at you. Who is this man? John looked intently at his friend. Anthony Volkov, nicknamed the Wolf, David replied, known for his connections in semi-criminal circles. He supported Victor in his previous ventures, but apparently there's tension between them now. John pondered, considering how to use this fact. Volkov was an influential player, but also cautious and not prone to hasty decisions. If they could create discord between him and Victor, it could play into John's hands. "We need to find out the location of their meeting," he said, rising from his chair. "I'm not going to wait for them to strike first." David smirked, but his gaze remained serious. "I'm already working on it. We have a few hours to prepare." John knew that the stakes had become even higher. His opponent was free and ready for a counterattack, and the world around him was full of dangers. But he had a goal that made him stronger: to protect his son and uphold the truth, no matter what. Chapter 7. Invasion. After David left, John left the house, entrusting his neighbor with looking after Liam. He headed to meet his old contacts who had helped him last time. Time was running out, and every second felt like an eternity. John felt the tension in his chest intensify with each step. The streets were semi-deserted and looked mysterious, hiding hundreds of secrets and memories behind their windows. He chose a secluded spot opposite the old warehouse, which was used for illegal meetings. David's voice came over the radio channel. "They've arrived," his friend reported. "Victor is getting out of the car. He's clearly not in the best mood." John picked up his binoculars and saw Victor crossing the asphalt lot. Several muscular and serious-faced guards followed him. They entered the building, and the massive metal gates closed behind them. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense. Anthony Volkov, a tall man with slicked-back hair, sat at a massive oak table. His hands were folded on the table, and behind him stood two guards, appearing like rocks protecting their leader. "Have you realized what you've done, Victor?" Volkov spoke softly, but there was a hidden threat in his voice. "We've worked together many times, but your latest failure is dragging us all down." Victor swallowed. "Tony, give me some time and resources, and I'll regain control of the situation." Volkov sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You understand, don't you, that your mistake isn't just your problem? It's a threat to our entire operation." He paused, assessing Victor with an expression that was hard to read. John listened to every sound, using an audio device connected to the microphone David had installed. He waited for a chance to appear, for a crack to emerge that would be impossible to stop. Suddenly, a commotion started in the building. One of Volkov's guards, standing by the door, noticed a shadow outside the window and became alert. Everyone in the room froze, and only Mikhail's gaze swept across the faces present, as if checking who dared to eavesdrop. "And this makes our meeting even more interesting," Volkov sneered, his voice icy. Outside, John became alert, noticing movement at the entrance. A few minutes later, the doors burst open, and Volkov's men rushed out onto the street, weapons at the ready. John hid around the corner, his heart pounding in his chest, but he remained composed. He knew that a shootout was the last thing he wanted. It could lead to failure. David reacted quickly, contacting him via radio. "John, get out! They're on alert. You don't want to be discovered." But John didn't move. He saw Victor exit the building with Volkov. Their faces were tense, but no longer as confident. At that moment, a plan formed in John's mind. Instead of leaving, he decided to use the situation to create an even greater rift between them. He threw a small stone towards the opposite wall, causing one of the guards to be distracted. Taking advantage of the moment, John slipped to an old staircase and began ascending to the second floor of the warehouse, which overlooked the center of the room. Inside the building, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Volkov suddenly raised his hand, motioning everyone to silence. "Enough! If someone has decided to observe us, let them understand that their presence will not go unnoticed," he said with icy calm. Victor stepped forward, casting a quick glance at Volkov. "It's him!" he whispered, and his eyes narrowed. "I know it's John. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." At that moment, John, watching them from above, realized his presence had been revealed. Without hesitation, he threw a smoke bomb he had for unforeseen circumstances, and screams erupted in the room. The warehouse filled with thick smoke, obscuring visibility and creating chaos. "Confirmed. Excellent move, John. Get out while you have time." David shouted over the radio. John descended, taking advantage of the moment, and disappeared into a narrow alley, hearing the search for the smoke source beginning inside the warehouse. He managed to avoid an imminent confrontation, but he knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their standoff. Chapter 8. Sowing Doubt, Beginning the Hunt. When John returned home, he was trembling with tension. He felt his muscles burning from overexertion, and one thought pounded in his head. He had confronted Volkov, and now the beast would pursue him to the end. The thick smell of smoke still lingered in his nostrils, reminding him of the events at the warehouse. He understood that soon Viktor and Volkov would begin to act, and he just had to prepare. Sarah met him in the hallway with an anxious expression. She had already noticed that rumors about yesterday's events were circulating in the city. Although John did not intend to go into detail, the tension emanating from him spoke for itself. "Where have you been?" Her voice trembled, tinged with fear and helplessness. "Not now, Sarah," John cut her off, walking past her into the room. He needed to think. He felt that he didn't have as much time to reflect as he would have liked. David appeared a couple of hours later. They met in John's garage, where it was safer to talk. The dim light of a lamp cast shadows on both men's faces, creating an atmosphere of conspiratorial comfort. "Good move with the smoke bomb," David said, smiling reservedly. "But you realize that now Volkov and Viktor will be even more cautious?" John nodded, sitting down on a chair and leaning on the table. His fingers drummed nervously on the old wood. "They are looking for a way to strike back. And now we have an advantage. They know we're close, but they don't know what we're capable of," he said, taking his gaze off David. "But there's also bad news." David looked up, his face serious. "Volkov has started mobilizing his men, and they've already begun checking your contacts. Most likely, they'll soon reach me and your other acquaintances." John froze, assessing what he had heard. This meant they were a step ahead, but any wrong move could destroy their advantage. He understood that now his actions had to be more sophisticated and precise. "We need a new plan," John said quietly, rising from his chair. "I want to deliver a blow that will make them doubt every step they take. We need to make Volkov and Viktor start suspecting each other." David raised his eyebrows. "Interesting idea, but how are you going to do that? Volkov doesn't like weakness and he fears betrayals. And we must feed him information that will make him doubt Viktor's loyalty and then watch their alliance crumble," John replied, a spark of calculated madness in his eyes. The next day, John and David acted quickly. They used an old connection with an informant who worked for Volkov to leak accidental data. The report spoke of Viktor's alleged meeting with Volkov's competitors, hinting at preparations for a deal behind his patron's back. This leak was cleverly disguised as ordinary business papers that only someone close to Volkov's circles would discover. Meanwhile, in Volkov's office, the atmosphere was tense. Anthony, after reading the document placed before him, threw the paper on the table and looked at his men. His cold eyes gleamed with anger. "So this is how we play, Viktor?" His voice was menacingly quiet. "You decided to turn your back on me?" One of the nervously swallowed, looking away. Volkov stood up, rubbing his temples, and surveyed his men with a scrutinizing, suspicious gaze. Viktor suspected nothing when he entered Volkov's office the next morning. He was sure that the discussion of new plans to restore their influence would continue. But instead of the usual cold greeting, he met Anthony's harsh gaze and complete silence in the room. "Sit down, Viktor," Volkov said, his voice steel. Viktor froze for a moment, but obeyed, feeling the tension rise. His heart beat faster as he tried to understand what had gone wrong. "We've always been honest with each other, haven't we?" Volkov continued, playing with a pen on the table. "That's why I'm sure you'll explain to me why you needed negotiations behind my back." Viktor blinked in confusion. He didn't know how to react, but his mind was already searching for a culprit. The only name that came to mind was John Miller. He felt beads of sweat appear on his forehead. Volkov's office, which had once seemed like a place of power to him, now weighed on him with double heaviness. Anthony was a man who did not tolerate betrayal, and any mistake could lead to fatal consequences. "Anthony, I don't understand what you're talking about," Viktor said, trying to make his voice sound confident, but his hands trembled slightly. Volkov smirked. His eyes gleamed with icy light. "You don't understand?" He picked up a printout from the table and threw it in front of Viktor. "This, Viktor. Explain to me the data leak about your meeting with people I consider our competitors. How do you explain this accidental visit?" Viktor looked at the document, his gaze quickly scanning the lines. He understood that this information looked convincing, even too convincing, but he couldn't remember ever touching on such negotiations. This was someone's skillful move, and he knew who was behind it: John Miller. The former friend had become a shadow for him, threatening, looming over everything he had built. "This is a provocation," Viktor said, trying to hide his agitation. "I didn't even get close to these people. Someone is playing against us, Anthony. And I know who." Volkov raised his eyebrows, his interest piqued. "Go on." "John Miller, a former Marine Corps officer," Viktor explained. "He knows me, and it seems he won't stop until he sees me humiliated. He did this to sow doubt and undermine our alliance. Victor's voice grew stronger as he saw Volkov listening intently. Anthony pondered. He didn't like feeling manipulated, and Victor trying to justify himself was logical, but also remained a risk. However, John's name was already familiar to him. Rumors of the recent incident at the warehouse had reached his ears. "I know about your past with this man," Volkov said after a pause. "But if he is indeed interfering in our affairs, that's bad news for all of us. He has already started a war," Victor continued, noticing that Volkov was gradually changing his tone from accusatory to evaluative. "But if we work together, we can stop him. He doesn't expect us to start a hunt." Volkov nodded, seemingly agreeing. Something flashed in his eyes that made Victor relax for a moment. But that moment was brief. "All right," Volkov said, standing up. "But remember, Victor, if I find out you deviated from the truth by even a millimeter, there will be no second chance." Victor slowly exhaled and nodded, feeling the tension in the room ease. Now he knew that Volkov would not act against him, at least for the time being. But this meant that the hunt for John had begun. John and David learned of Volkov's reaction from their informant. David, relaying the news, looked at John with concern. "They are starting to act, and you are now in their crosshairs," he said, running a hand through his hair. "You created a rift between them, but now they will unite to find you." John smirked, but his eyes remained serious. "That's exactly what I wanted. They will look for me, but that will give us time for the next phase." David nodded, but a shadow of doubt still lingered on his face. "What about Sarah and Liam? Volkov is known for his brutality. He might try to strike at them to get to you." These words made John freeze. He knew that any mention of Sarah and Liam upset him. He thought of his son, his carefree laughter, and how soundly he slept last night, unaware of the storm that was brewing. This was his weakness, but also his strongest motivation. "I will protect them, David. We need to be one step ahead. If they start the hunt, we will make them believe they are in control." John paused, considering his every move. "And then we'll strike when they least expect it." David looked at him, understanding that the stakes had become even higher. John was already ready for the next stage. Chapter 9. Bait for the enemy. John knew that the peaceful days were behind him. In the morning, as he sat with a cup of coffee, his thoughts were focused on Liam and Sarah's safety. Despite all the pain and disappointment that his wife's betrayal had brought, she remained his son's mother, and if Volkov and Victor decided to strike at him through his family, the consequences could be catastrophic. David continued to support him, sending updates on Volkov's movements. It turned out that Volkov had sent his men to place John's house under surveillance. One of John's former comrades in arms, now working for David, confirmed that surveillance had intensified, including around the school where Liam studied. This was a warning. They were ready to go to extreme measures. "We must take action," David said, meeting John in a cafe on the outskirts of the city. He looked tense, his hands nervously fiddling with a spoon with leftover sugar. "If they decide to act, it will be difficult for you to protect everyone at once." John listened silently, his eyes fixed on the distance. He had already thought through dozens of scenarios, each leading him to one conclusion. It was necessary to move Sarah and Liam to a safe place. "I've already arranged with an old friend, Mark, for them to be moved to his ranch out of town," John said, without taking his eyes off the window. "They will have security there, but it's a temporary measure. We need something more sustainable." David nodded. "I'll help organize everything. But what will you do yourself? They are clearly targeting you." John turned to his friend, determination in his eyes. "I will become the bait. Let them think I've fallen into a trap." In the evening, John returned home earlier than usual. Sarah noticed his nervousness and tried to start a conversation, but his cold and stern gaze stopped her. "We need to leave," John said, trying to keep his voice calm, though a storm raged inside. "Liam will be safe out of town. I will provide security." "John, what's happening?" Sarah's voice trembled with fear and incomprehension. "Little time," he replied, packing things for his son. Having gathered everything necessary, they left the city late in the evening. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, holding the sleeping Liam's hand, her face reflecting fear and helplessness. John drove, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white, checking the mirrors every minute. When they reached the rural house, security was already waiting for them. John's old friend Mark, who had once served with him in hot spots, met them at the gate. His muscular figure and confident expression inspired confidence. "They will be safe here," Mark assured, patting John on the shoulder. John nodded briefly in response and walked into the darkness, leaving his family under protection to continue his dangerous game. The next day, Viktor and Volkov gathered in a hidden location. Their conversation was heated to the limit. "John has left the house. We could not determine his location," one of Volkov's men reported. Viktor frowned, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "So he knows we're watching him. That complicates the task." Volkov looked at Viktor. His eyes flashed with suspicion. "Or did you warn him to avoid possible problems?" he asked with an insinuation that caused tension in the air. Viktor's head snapped up, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and resentment. "Are you accusing me? If I wanted to help him, I wouldn't be sitting here, Anthony. If you want to see a traitor, find him elsewhere." Volkov frowned but said nothing. He could not afford to ignite a conflict with a man who could still be useful. Instead, he decided to increase pressure on John and force him to reveal himself. Meanwhile, John was preparing for a decisive step. He left several false leads to make Volkov and Viktor believe in his vulnerability. If the plan worked, he would not only confuse them but also gain information about their further actions. John knew that every minute was working against him. As long as Sarah and Liam were safe at the rural ranch, he could focus on developing a plan to finally eliminate Viktor and Volkov. He left several false leads that led to an abandoned building and now waited for the opponents to act. David met him in a small garage on the outskirts of the city where they secluded themselves to discuss the last details. The place was lit only by a dim lamp which cast long shadows, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. "It's ready. They will surely want to check your tracks," David said, placing a city map on the table. "We will have a live broadcast. If they come, we'll know immediately." John nodded, looking closely at the map, which marked possible escape routes and hidden observation points. He felt that the moment of truth was near. "If they come quietly," he repeated, as if deep in thought. And they came. Volkov and Viktor were already discussing their plan of action. The information leak about the place where John was allegedly hiding stirred their interest. Volkov, without losing time, sent his team for reconnaissance. Viktor, who began to suspect that John might be using traps, insisted on a more cautious approach, but Volkov was too confident in his strength and influence. "We must act now, before he disappears completely." Anthony insisted, his voice authoritative, his eyes burning with determination. "I want to see this man disappear from our game." Viktor nodded silently, though suspicion grew in his heart. John was not a person who would leave such obvious traces. It could be a trick. But Volkov did not listen to his warnings. Movement was detected in the abandoned building. Several cars stopped at the main entrance, and people in dark jackets emerged, heading inside. John and David, observing the scene from a monitor, exchanged quick glances. "They're here," David said, confirming the obvious. John nodded and continued to watch. This was his chance. Volkov's group of men entered the building, looking around and checking every corner. Suddenly, one of them noticed a blinking indicator light on the floor. It was one of the fake cameras deliberately left to attract attention. "Looks like our fugitive left us a gift," one of the fighters sneered, kicking the camera. At that moment, David activated a pre-recorded audio message. John's voice was heard from the speakers, echoing through the entire premises. "You like to hunt, but are you ready to become the prey?" This caused confusion among Volkov's men. They began to look around, trying to find the source of the sound. Suddenly, the lights in the building went out, and everything plunged into complete darkness. A moment later, there was a loud explosion of a small noise grenade intended for disorientation. This gave John and David time for their next move. Volkov watched the events through a video feed installed in his office. When the image became intermittent and then disappeared, his face contorted with rage. He realized that he had fallen into a trap, and someone was skillfully playing against him. Viktor stood nearby, clenching his fists. He understood that Volkov would look for culprits, and he himself was at the center of suspicion. "This is a trap," Viktor said, looking at Volkov. "We must review our plan and understand who is behind this." "Didn't you betray us, Viktor?" Volkov sharply turned to him, his gaze full of distrust. "You know too much and offer too much. If I wanted that, you would already know," Viktor replied, trying to keep his composure. "But now is not the time for internal squabbles. We need to find him and finish this matter once and for all." Volkov paused. His eyes darted from side to side, assessing the situation. He knew he was losing control, but he needed to finish what he started. John and David watched these last snippets of video, actively absorbing them. Now they knew that Volkov and Viktor would have to go through a test of trust in each other. The offensive was beginning, and the game was approaching its decisive stage. Chapter 10. Operation Hunter becomes hunted. After the night operation, John and David meticulously analyzed the reaction of Volkov and his men. The false trail and the staged event deceived them, making Volkov feel vulnerable and forcing Victor to prove his loyalty. Now their alliance seemed fragile, like thin glass. "We have a few days, no more," David said, looking at John across the table. "Volkov will want to respond, but not immediately. He will look for you to sort things out before acting." "Exactly," John confirmed, crossing his arms. "We will make them doubt each other to such an extent that they will destroy themselves." Tension reigned in Volkov's office. People walked through the corridors with sullen faces, speaking in hushed tones. Anthony sat in his office, pondering every step. He knew he couldn't afford to lose control of the situation. John had proven to be smarter than he initially seemed. This made Volkov nervous and compelled him to look for a reason within his own team. Victor, on the other hand, was ready to act and decided to take the initiative. He proposed a new plan. "Anthony, we must play on his weaknesses," Victor said, entering the office. "He protects his family. We can use that." Volkov squinted, evaluating Victor's words. "Are you suggesting we strike at his family?" he asked coldly. "No," Victor replied, remaining calm. "I suggest creating the illusion of a threat and showing that we see everything. This will make him make a mistake." Anthony thought, then he nodded, a glint in his eyes. The plan was risky, but it allowed them to regain control and once again take the dominant position. David contacted John the next day with disturbing news. "They have changed tactics. Volkov has information about your family. It looks like they plan to create pressure," he said, his voice tense. John's temples pounded. He had expected Volkov and Victor to start suspecting each other, but he didn't expect them to move to such a step so quickly. "We must convince them that I am ready to do anything to protect my family," he said, trying to think of a new move. "I want them to think I'm on the verge and capable of desperate acts." David looked at him carefully. "Are you sure this won't get out of control?" "In this game, there's no room left for doubt," John replied, his gaze as hard as steel. Meanwhile, Sarah and Liam continued to remain in hiding at the rural ranch, under the protection of Mark and his team. Liam joyfully ran around the yard, unaware of the clouds gathering around his family. Sarah, on the other hand, felt like a hostage to the situation. Her fear and guilt mixed into a knot she couldn't untangle. Late in the evening, as Mark sat by the gate watching the perimeter, his mobile phone rang. It was John. "How are things?" John asked curtly. "Everything's under control," Mark replied, but his voice sounded wary. "We had a couple of cars here that drove too close, but they didn't stop." "Keep me updated," John said and hung up before giving in to his emotions. He knew that time was pressing and every wrong step could lead to disaster. Volkov began to act. One of his men arrived at the ranch disguised as a repairman, leaving a note with a threat. It contained only a few words. "We see you, Sarah." Sarah found the note in the morning and immediately gave it to Mark, who promptly informed John. Hearing this, John felt everything inside him seethe with rage, but at the same time he felt a strange cold calm wash over him. "Now they think they have me by the throat, but that's their mistake," John whispered. He knew this was his chance to strike back. The plan was to use false leads and make Volkov and Victor believe that John was close to madness, ready to do anything for his family. John meticulously prepared for what was to be the culmination of his plan. He wanted Volkov and Victor to feel his every move, to be on edge, ready for extreme measures. If he could make them believe he had lost control, they would come out of hiding, and then he could deliver the final blow. Late in the evening, John sent Victor a message through an anonymous channel used in their circles for transmitting critical data. The text contained a short and terrifying warning. "I'm coming for you. You will feel the same as I do. Your friend is next." This last phrase was specially added to make Volkov consider that their alliance might be under threat. David met him in the same garage where they had been making plans for the past few weeks. His face expressed a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Are you sure this will work?" he asked, looking at John. "They might consider this a desperate move and strike first." John nodded. His eyes glowed with cold, steely determination, and caution had been replaced by absolute confidence. "Even if so, that's their mistake, and mistakes are what we need." The next morning, Victor received the message and, reading it, felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to hide his anxiety, but his hands trembled slightly. He knew John was clever, but now it seemed his enemy was ready to go to extremes. "Anthony, we must revise our plan," Victor said, entering the office with a haste that did not go unnoticed. Volkov looked at him from under his brow, evaluating every word. "So, you assume he will become the hunter?" Anthony smirked, his gaze cold and wary. I like his audacity, but this is his last mistake. Victor nodded, trying not to show how concerned he was. Volkov always considered himself the smartest in the room, and this overconfidence could play a cruel trick on him. We must make him believe that we are ready for his every move, Victor continued. But at the same time, convince him that we have another threat, someone who wants to eliminate him without a trace. Volkov pondered, then nodded. Let him see that we are one step ahead, he said with a cunning smile. But this time we will play by my rules. John and David watched the movements of Volkov's and Victor's men like pieces on a chessboard. They decided to show themselves. John drove his car and stopped near an old building that had once been the place of his meetings with Victor, when they were still friends. He knew that Volkov's men were following him, and he showed them that he was ready. Let them think I'm going to meet someone, he told David via radio communication. They shouldn't know it's a trap. Soon, several men in black uniforms emerged from the darkness, armed and ready for attack. John stood calmly, allowing them to approach. He wanted them to see his fear, his anger, and his readiness for madness. One of the guards approached closer and, gripping his weapon, said, Volkov sends his regards. But instead of answering, John smiled. Then he sharply raised his hand, in which he held a small transmitter. At that very moment, the building was filled with light and thunder. David activated the prepared flash effect and the sound of an explosion, which temporarily stunned the guards. Let's go, John shouted, jumping back. While Volkov's men were disoriented, he escaped along a pre-planned route, watching the chaos they left behind. Upon learning of the attack, Volkov was beside himself with rage. He couldn't understand how John had gotten so close to his men and managed to strike. The threads of control over the situation were slipping from his hands. He guessed that John was bluffing, but this bluff was more dangerous than all his previous actions. We must find him now, Volkov roared, his eyes bloodshot. And if any of you lied to me or made a mistake, everyone will pay for it. Victor remained silent, holding back his anger. He understood that every step was crucial now. Every small detail brought them closer to the moment when both he and Volkov could find themselves vulnerable. John and David took cover in a safe place, monitoring the unfolding events. The chaos they created began to bear fruit. Volkov and Victor were forced to reevaluate every step, suspecting each other and checking their own people. Their alliance was cracking at the seams. Now all that remained was to deliver the final blow and end this game. Their forces are now focused on searching for you and looking for culprits within their organization. This is our chance, David said. John nodded. He needed to figure out how to use this moment to finally disrupt their plans. The decision came quickly. They needed to give Volkov and Victor evidence that would make them believe that the betrayal was coming from within. John prepared materials that hinted that Victor might be collaborating with Volkov's enemies, using John merely as a diversion. Volkov, as expected, was paranoid and instantly believed the false information. He immediately felt anger rising within him. The text read, Your closest ally has long been playing a double game. John is just part of the plan. Volkov crumpled the note, and his face contorted with rage. He summoned Victor to his office. You know, right? What's going on now? Volkov asked coldly, piercing Victor with his gaze. First the attack, now these hints. I need to know the truth. Victor realized that Volkov was on the edge and any wrong word could cost him his life. Anthony, I swear I have nothing to do with this. This is John's work. He's playing with us, making us suspect each other. Victor's voice trembled, but he tried to maintain composure. Volkov stood up, his shadow falling over Victor. If this is a lie, you will answer for it, he said, and there was not a trace of doubt in his voice. John and David knew that everything had to happen quickly now. They used their police connections to transmit information about Volkov's illegal activities. It was risky, but John knew it was time to end the game. A few hours later, Volkov received a message from his informant. The police were preparing to raid his warehouse, where compromising documents were stored. He immediately gave orders to remove all traces. Victor, hearing these commands, began to understand that Volkov no longer trusted him. This was the moment when everything they had built for years began to crumble. Are you sure there's no fault of yours here, Victor? Volkov asked, his face ashen from tension. Yes, Victor replied firmly, but he understood that words no longer mattered. When the police operation began, the warehouse was partially cleared, but the documents found were sufficient to open a case against Volkov. His men were apprehended, and the information quickly spread throughout the city, destroying his reputation and influence. Volkov was arrested, his malicious eyes gleaming with rage and fear as he was led to the car. Victor tried to avoid the same fate, but understood that his hour had come. Left alone in the empty office, he realized that the game was over. John had exploited their weaknesses and managed to sow discord between them, making them doubt each other. Looking out the window at the streetlights, Victor clenched his fists. This was his last mistake. John and David followed the news. When confirmation of Volkov's arrest came, David turned to John, and his face lit up with a smile for the first time in a long time. "You did it," he said, shaking his friend's hand. John didn't smile, but a spark of satisfaction glinted in his eyes. He knew the path had been difficult and full of pain, but he had fulfilled his mission, protected his family, and punished the traitors. "This is just the beginning of a new chapter," he said quietly. "But now everything will be by my rules." Dawn was breaking outside the window, and John felt a new life finally beginning to breathe in this world without deceit and fear. Excerpts from John's maneuvers: The hunter becomes the hunted. John knew that the peaceful days were behind him. In the morning, as he sat with a cup of coffee, his thoughts were focused on Liam and Sarah's safety. Despite all the pain and disappointment that his wife's betrayal had brought, she remained his son's mother, and if Volkov and Victor decided to strike at him through his family, the consequences could be catastrophic. David continued to support him, sending updates on Volkov's movements. It turned out that Volkov had sent his men to place John's house under surveillance. One of John's former comrades in arms, now working for David, confirmed that surveillance had intensified, including around the school where Liam studied. This was a warning. They were ready to go to extreme measures. "We must take action," David said, meeting John in a cafe on the outskirts of the city. He looked tense, his hands nervously fiddling with a spoon with leftover sugar. "If they decide to act, it will be difficult for you to protect everyone at once." John listened silently, his eyes fixed on the distance. He had already thought through dozens of scenarios, each leading him to one conclusion: it was necessary to move Sarah and Liam to a safe place. "I've already arranged with an old friend, Mark, for them to be moved to his ranch out of town," John said, without taking his eyes off the window. "They will have security there, but it's a temporary measure. We need something more sustainable." David nodded. "I'll help organize everything. But what will you do yourself? They are clearly targeting you." John turned to his friend, determination in his eyes. "I will become the bait. Let them think I've fallen into a trap." In the evening, John returned home earlier than usual. Sarah noticed his nervousness and tried to start a conversation, but his cold and stern gaze stopped her. "We need to leave," John said, trying to keep his voice calm though a storm raged inside. "Liam will be safe out of town. I will provide security." "John, what's happening?" Sarah's voice trembled with fear and incomprehension. "Little time," he replied, packing things for his son. Having gathered everything necessary, they left the city late in the evening. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, holding the sleeping Liam's hand, her face reflecting fear and helplessness. John drove, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white, checking the mirrors every minute. When they reached the rural house, security was already waiting for them. John's old friend Mark, who had once served with him in hot spots, met them at the gate. His muscular figure and confident expression inspired confidence. "They will be safe here," Mark assured, patting John on the shoulder. John nodded briefly in response and walked into the darkness, leaving his family under protection to continue his dangerous game. The next day, Victor and Volkov gathered in a hidden location. Their conversation was heated to the limit. "John has left the house. We could not determine his location," one of Volkov's men reported. Victor frowned, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "So he knows we're watching him. That complicates the task." Volkov looked at Victor. His eyes flashed with suspicion. "Or did you warn him to avoid possible problems?" he asked with an insinuation that caused tension in the air. Victor's head snapped up, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and resentment. "Are you accusing me? If I wanted to help him, I wouldn't be sitting here, Anthony. If you want to see a traitor, find him elsewhere." Volkov frowned but said nothing. He could not afford to ignite a conflict with a man who could still be useful. Instead, he decided to increase pressure on John and force him to reveal himself. Meanwhile, John was preparing for a decisive step. He left several false leads to make Volkov and Victor believe in his vulnerability. If the plan worked, he would not only confuse them but also gain information about their further actions. John knew that every minute was working against him. As long as Sarah and Liam were safe at the rural ranch, he could focus on developing a plan to finally eliminate Victor and Volkov. He left several false leads that led to an abandoned building and now waited for the opponents to act. David met him in a small garage on the outskirts of the city where they secluded themselves to discuss the last details. The place was lit only by a dim lamp which cast long shadows, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. "It's ready. They will surely want to check your tracks," David said, placing a city map on the table. "We will have a live broadcast. If they come, we'll know immediately." John nodded, looking closely at the map, which marked possible escape routes and hidden observation points. He felt that the moment of truth was near. "If they come quietly," he repeated as if deep in thought. And they came. Volkov and Victor were already discussing their plan of action. The information leak about the place where John was allegedly hiding stirred their interest. Volkov, without losing time, sent his team for reconnaissance. Victor, who began to suspect that John might be using traps, insisted on a more cautious approach, but Volkov was too confident in his strength and influence. "We must act now, before he disappears completely." Anthony insisted, his voice authoritative, his eyes burning with determination. "I want to see this man disappear from our game." Victor nodded silently, though suspicion grew in his heart. John was not a person who would leave such obvious traces. It could be a trick. But Volkov did not listen to his warnings. Movement was detected in the abandoned building. Several cars stopped at the main entrance, and people in dark jackets emerged, heading inside. John and David, observing the scene from a monitor, exchanged quick glances. "They're here," David said, confirming the obvious. John nodded and continued to watch. This was his chance. Volkov's group of men entered the building, looking around and checking every corner. Suddenly, one of them noticed a blinking indicator light on the floor. It was one of the fake cameras deliberately left to attract attention. "Looks like our fugitive left us a gift," one of the fighters sneered, kicking the camera. At that moment, David activated a pre-recorded audio message. John's voice was heard from the speakers, echoing through the entire premises. "You like to hunt, but are you ready to become the prey?" This caused confusion among Volkov's men. They began to look around, trying to find the source of the sound. Suddenly, the lights in the building went out and everything plunged into complete darkness. A moment later, there was a loud explosion of a small noise grenade intended for disorientation. This gave John and David time for their next move. Volkov watched the events through a video feed installed in his office. When the image became intermittent and then disappeared, his face contorted with rage. He realized that he had fallen into a trap, and someone was skillfully playing against him. Victor stood nearby, clenching his fists. He understood that Volkov would look for culprits, and he himself was at the center of suspicion. "This is a trap," Victor said, looking at Volkov. "We must review our plan and understand who is behind this." "Didn't you betray us, Victor?" Volkov sharply turned to him, his gaze full of distrust. "You know too much and offer too much." "If I wanted that, you would already know," Victor replied, trying to keep his composure. "But now is not the time for internal squabbles. We need to find him and finish this matter once and for all." Volkov paused. His eyes darted from side to side, assessing the situation. He knew he was losing control, but he needed to finish what he started. John and David watched these last snippets of video, actively absorbing them. Now they knew that Volkov and Victor would have to go through a test of trust in each other. The offensive was beginning, and the game was approaching its decisive stage.